Have you ever felt like you were totally tricked? Like something you thought was one thing turned out to be something completely different?
Yeah, like a really clever ruse.
Well, you're not the only one.
No, not at all.
When you really look closely, the natural world is just full of these amazing acts of deception.
It is really remarkable. Across so many different species, you see all of these ingenious strategies at play, with one creature gaining the upper hand by fooling another.
And that's exactly what we are going to dive deep into today, just for you.
Absolutely.
Based on this fascinating material you gave us, we're going to explore this sneaky side of nature, the world of interspecies deception.
That's right.
We've got this great chapter excerpt here that lays out some absolutely mind-bending examples of how different species manage to pull these cons off.
Indeed. And at the heart of it all is a really fundamental concept.
Okay.
Often referred to as the second law of cheating.
All right, the second law of cheating.
Which boils down to this: how one organism can exploit the inherent weaknesses in another creature's senses.
Uh-huh.
Or even the way their brain processes information.
Okay, so instead of outright lying, it's more about understanding someone's blind spots and using that to your advantage.
Yeah.
Like a master magician knowing exactly how to misdirect your attention.
That's a wonderful analogy.
Yeah.
Think of it as understanding those cognitive loopholes that make deception so effective in the natural world.
Okay.
It's not just about sending a false message, which would be the first law,
Right.
but about exploiting how that message, or even the absence of a message, is interpreted.
Okay, I'm starting to get it.
Yeah.
So where do we see this second law at work right away?
Well, perfect illustration comes from a story in the chapter about a mother mallard
Okay.
in East China.
Okay.
And, given your interest in animal behavior,
Yes.
you'll probably find this particularly insightful.
I remember skimming that part.
Yeah.
Remind me of the details so we can really unpack how the second law plays out.
So the author recounts being with a young local named Lao, who spots a mother mallard with her ducklings. And, Lao, understandably perhaps, given the village's reliance on foraging, got quite excited
Right.
at the prospect of catching them for food.
The chapter does mention wild animals can be a pretty important source of protein.
Exactly.
For the villagers. So Lao saw an opportunity for a meal.
Precisely.
Mm.
And despite a request not to catching, Lao pursued them in a small boat.
Oh, no!
And they quickly cornered the duck family, and in the chaos, the ducklings scattered. But then Lao suddenly exclaimed that the mother duck couldn't fly.
Oh, right.
That she was injured.
The dramatic display.
Yes.
The flapping wing, the seemingly desperate struggle to fly. So Lao naturally shifts his focus to the apparently injured adult, thinking it's going to be a bigger, easier catch.
Exactly. And here's where that second law comes into play.
Okay.
The duck is exploiting Lao's natural tendency to focus on the most conspicuous and seemingly vulnerable target.
Oh, that's so clever.
But what happens next is key. Just as Lao was about to grab her, the mother duck suddenly took off completely unharmed, flying away effortlessly with her brood. And when they went back to look for the ducklings, they had all vanished, hidden perfectly.
It's the ultimate bait and switch.
It is.
The author even remarks that if you don't understand their tricks, you won't get any wild duck.
Right.
It's a classic example of being completely fooled by exploiting a natural instinct.
It is, and in biology, this behavior is known as a distraction display. The mother duck faked an injury, a highly salient visual cue, to draw the predator's attention away from her vulnerable offspring.
Clever.
The loophole being exploited is the predator's focus on that seemingly easy meal.
Right, so this isn't just some quirky duck behavior.
Yeah.
Other birds use similar tactics to misdirect predators.
Absolutely. The chapter mentions plovers, and especially killdeer, as common examples of birds employing these distraction displays. And there's this charming little anecdote about a killdeer faking an injury when the author accidentally got too close to her nest.
Oh, right near the shot put training ground.
Exactly.
Imagine that this delicate nest right in the middle of all that activity. It really shows how vulnerable they can be.
Precisely. And the killdeer's display, although intended to distract, actually ended up alerting the author to the nest's location. Which highlights that even these well-honed deceptions aren't always foolproof.
Of course.
There's always a risk involved.
Right. So that's one way to fool a predator.
Yeah.
Make them focus on a convincing but false target.
Right.
What other sneaky ways do animals exploit these cognitive loopholes?
Another widespread tactic, and one you've probably heard of,
Yeah.
is feigning death, often referred to as playing possum.
Ah, yes, the dramatic flop.
Yes.
I always just associated that with opossums.
Right.
It's like their namesake.
It is, while opossums are certainly masters of it.
It's a surprisingly common strategy across the animal kingdom.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah.
Interesting.
The chapter discusses how even barnyard hens will suddenly freeze when chased.
Huh.
The idea here is that struggling might actually trigger a predator's killing instinct.
Yeah.
Whereas complete stillness might cause them to lose interest.
Oh.
The loophole being exploited is the predator's focus on movement as a sign of life and potential prey.
Like how a cat will often lose interest in a toy mouse once it stops wiggling.
Exactly.
The movement is what triggers the hunting drive.
Exactly. And that pause in the predator's focus, even if just for a moment, can provide a crucial window for escape. Lizards also play possum. When threatened by snakes who tend to prefer live prey, woodchucks will often freeze solid when they feel cornered.
And the chapter even mentioned antelopes sometimes playing dead when caught by cheetahs or leopards.
Yeah.
That's incredible to picture. You see those dramatic escapes in nature documentaries, and now it makes more sense why it might work. It's a risky gamble.
Yeah.
Relying on the predator to loosen their grip prematurely, but when it works and the predator momentarily loses interest in a seemingly lifeless meal, it can be life-saving.
Now, the chapter also touched on the human context with playing possum with grizzly bears.
Yeah.
That sounds absolutely terrifying.
It is a true last resort in a very specific situation.
Yeah.
The thinking is that grizzly bears are often territorial and might attack. If they feel threatened by lying perfectly motionless, you might no longer be perceived as a threat.
Oh, okay.
However, and this is crucial, the chapter makes a very important distinction. Never ever try this with a black bear.
Okay.
As they do scavenge and eat dead animals.
Right.
So feigning death could actually make you a more appealing meal.
That's vital advice. A really important and potentially life-saving difference to keep in mind.
Absolutely.
And then there were the fainting goats.
Oh, yeah?
That was a surprising and somewhat unsettling twist.
It was indeed. Early European settlers in America even selectively bred goats that would dramatically faint when stressed or startled.
Oh.
And these unfortunate goats would become easy targets for predators, potentially diverting attention and saving more valuable livestock. A rather grim example of exploitation by humans.
So these goats weren't actually faking it.
Yeah.
It was a real involuntary physical response.
Exactly.
Wow.
The chapter explains that this fainting in these goats is due to a genetic condition called congenital myotonia.
Oh.
Caused by a recessive gene.
Oh.
Their muscles seize up involuntarily.
Oh, wow.
At a fight or flight moment, causing them to collapse.
Wow. So a genetic quirk, an actual physical limitation being exploited by humans for a rather dark purpose.
Yes.
It really underscores how these deceptive-like behaviors, whether intentional or due to a biological quirk, can play a significant role in the survival of others.
And as the chapter emphasizes, all of these examples, from the duck's feigned injury to the goat's involuntary collapse, fall under this second law of cheating. They are all about exploiting those inherent cognitive or sensory weaknesses in another creature.
Yeah.
It's a different strategy altogether from the first law, which, as we mentioned, focuses on actively altering messages in communication.
The first law is like sending a false signal, a lie.
Yes.
The second law is more about taking advantage of how someone receives and interprets.
That's right.
A signal or even the lack of a signal.
Exactly.
It's about understanding their perceptual filters.
Exactly. And this deception can occur not just between different species, like the clever mallard and the hopeful owl, but also within the same species.
Right.
The chapter really sets the stage for us to explore many more diverse and fascinating examples of this second law in action.
And after laying this foundation, the chapter moves on to a really fundamental and thought-provoking question. Why do these cognitive loopholes even exist in the first place?
Yeah.
It uses the intriguing example of the blind cave tetra to illustrate this.
This is a truly fantastic example.
Yeah.
The blind cave tetra in the dark caves of Mexico.
Okay.
Evolved from ancestors that possessed sight. But in the complete and utter darkness, having eyes became not only completely useless, but also energetically quite costly to maintain.
Use it or lose it in action.
Yeah.
As the chapter aptly puts it, if a particular trait offers absolutely no benefit in the environment and actually drains valuable resources, then natural selection will likely favor individuals who lose that trait over time.
Precisely. Furthermore, eyes can actually be a point of vulnerability.
Oh.
Susceptible to injury and infection.
Right.
So in the pitch black caves, losing eyesight actually became advantageous.
Oh, wow.
Allowing the fish to allocate those precious resources, energy, nutrients,
Yeah.
to developing other more beneficial senses, like enhanced touch and smell.
Wow. It really brings home this idea that animals can't be the best at absolutely everything.
Yeah.
There are always trade-offs in how resources are allocated for survival. It's like trying to build a Swiss Army knife.
Yeah.
Each tool takes away resources from others.
Absolutely. The chapter uses a really clear analogy of government budgeting.
Okay.
If you decide to spend more in one area,
right,
you inevitably have to cut back somewhere else.
Right.
Evolution operates on a similar principle.
Yeah.
Of efficiency.
Okay.
Favoring the development and maintenance of senses.
Yeah.
That provide the greatest return in terms of survival and reproduction within a specific environment.
So these sensory limitations, these cognitive loopholes, are in a way the evolutionary price we pay for specializing and excelling in other areas that are more crucial for our survival.
Exactly. And this naturally leads us to consider our own sensory limitations as humans. We pride ourselves on our vision, but our sense of smell, for instance, is nowhere near as acute as that of a dog.
Oh, for sure.
And we're completely unable to perceive things like infrared or ultraviolet light.
Which is something so many other animals rely on.
Right.
The chapter lists vipers with their ability to see infrared, birds that can see in UV rodents that communicate with ultrasonic hearing. It's like they're experiencing a completely different and richer sensory world that's invisible to us.
They absolutely are. And we also lack abilities that are commonplace in other species, like the echolocation used by bats.
Right.
To navigate. Or the ability of elephants to sense seismic vibrations through the ground.
Wow.
These are all areas where other creatures have a distinct advantage. And our inherent deficiencies can, in turn, leave us vulnerable to exploitation.
Makes sense.
Just think back to Lau being completely fooled by a purely visual trick from the mallard.
Right. We rely so heavily on our sense of sight that we might easily miss other crucial cues, or be particularly susceptible to visual illusions and deceptions. And while we've developed amazing technology to help compensate for some of our sensory gaps, other animals rely solely on their innate senses, making them potentially prime targets for those who know how to exploit these loopholes.
Which brings us to the core concept of sensory exploitation.
Sensory exploitation.
Well, this term is often used in the context of sexual selection, where males might evolve traits that exploit pre-existing sensory biases in females. Here we're looking at it more broadly. It's about how one species can take advantage of those inherent biases, weaknesses, deficiencies, those cognitive loopholes in another's sensory system for their own gain, whether it's to find food, avoid being eaten, or reproduce.
And these inherent loopholes are like an open invitation for the evolution of deception, leading to the development of fascinating strategies like mimicry, where one species evolves to resemble another, or even an inanimate object to fool a receiver.
Precisely. The chapter gives some really compelling examples of this sensory exploitation in action.
Like guppies being particularly attracted to the color orange. And then certain prawns evolving bright orange spots to lure those guppies in for a meal.
Exactly.
That's a predator directly exploiting a pre-existing preference in its prey.
Exactly. Or consider death adders. That wriggle their tails in a way that strikingly resembles a small worm, perfectly designed to attract unsuspecting lizards.
Oh, wow.
Or bola spiders that emit pheromones that mimic the sex attractants of female moths, luring male moths straight into their sticky trap.
Oh, it's awful.
It's all about tapping into a pre-wired sensory response.
And it's not just predators exploiting the weaknesses of their prey. The chapter points out that prey also constantly evolve tactics to exploit the potential loopholes in their predator senses and cognitive processing.
That's right.
It's this continuous evolutionary arms race.
An ongoing back and forth, constantly driving innovation in both the art of deception and the ability to detect it.
So interesting. The chapter then shifts our focus to camouflage as another really effective form of this second law at work, using the intriguing example of the Pacific tree frog. This was a fascinating little study that really highlighted how complex, seemingly simple camouflage can be.
It was indeed. At Inglehorn Pond, researchers observed these frogs in two primary color morphs. Some were predominantly gray, while others were green. What was striking was how well each morph seemed to blend in perfectly with its immediate background, the gray frogs on bark, the green frogs on leaves.
Yeah.
The central question was, how did they achieve this remarkable camouflage?
The chapter outlined two main hypotheses. The know your own color hypothesis, suggesting frogs choose backgrounds that match their inherent color, and the chameleon hypothesis, proposing they actively change color to match their surroundings. So which one turned out to be the main explanation?
Well, their initial lab experiments were quite revealing. They found that while both the gray and green morphs had a limited ability to subtly adjust their shade in the short term, neither could make rapid, dramatic switches between being distinctly gray and distinctly green. This strongly suggested that the frogs likely do know their own color and actively seek out habitats that provide the best camouflage.
But then they took their research into the field.
Yeah.
And uncovered something even more compelling, right?
Yes.
Something about where the frogs tended to stay.
Yes. Through careful observation, they discovered a remarkable level of site fidelity. Individual frogs tended to return to the exact same spots.
Oh, wow.
Day after day.
Interesting.
This made it much easier to track them and provided further evidence. Supporting the know-your-own-color hypothesis.
Okay.
However, biology rarely fits neatly into simple categories, and there was a minor surprise. A small percentage of the frogs did show the ability to switch morphs over much longer periods, months rather than days.
So while the primary strategy is choosing the right background based on their inherent color, some individuals have this longer-term ability to adapt if their environment changes.
Exactly.
It's like having a backup plan in the camouflage department.
Precisely. But as the chapter goes on to point out,
Yeah.
many other animals are far more versatile
Right.
and quick-changing in their ability to alter their appearance,
Yeah.
truly earning the title of masters of disguise.
Yeah.
Think of creatures like chameleons, octopuses, and stick insects.
The real shapeshifters of the animal kingdom. And this perfectly leads us into the fascinating world of Batesian mimicry, a concept I've always found so incredibly clever.
Yes.
It's the art of being harmless, but looking harmful to avoid predation.
Named, of course, after the pioneering British naturalist Henry W. Bates, who made his groundbreaking observations while exploring the Amazon rainforest alongside Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace, as the chapter reminds us, had a rather unfortunate return journey, tragically losing all his collected specimens in a devastating shipwreck.
Oh, I remember that part.
Yes.
10 days adrift at sea, a truly harrowing experience.
Yes.
Thankfully, Bates remained in the Amazon.
Yeah.
And continued to make incredibly important scientific discoveries.
Indeed.
Yeah.
He was particularly struck by the vibrant heliconius butterflies.
Okay.
Noticing that several species that were perfectly edible and harmless bore a striking resemblance in color patterns and flight behavior to other butterfly species.
Okay.
Known to be toxic and distasteful to predators.
Oh, that's so interesting.
It puzzled him.
Yeah.
Until he read Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species and realized that the power of natural selection could provide a compelling explanation.
If a tasty butterfly just happens to look convincingly like a poisonous one, predators that have learned to avoid the toxic species will likely also avoid the harmless look-alike, significantly increasing its chances of survival. It's such a simple yet incredibly effective concept.
It is.
The chapter mentions Darwin's enthusiastic reaction to Bates's idea, which really underscores its scientific significance.
It does.
Yeah.
And the vast majority of animal mimicry we observe in nature falls under this category of Batesian mimicry.
Okay.
A palatable and unprotected species cleverly masquerading as something noxious, dangerous, or even just uninteresting like a twig or a leaf. All to deceive potential predators. Or even unsuspecting prey.
Wow.
Wallace's vivid description of these mimics as actors or masqueraders and even swindlers.
I love that.
Perfectly captures the essence of this evolutionary deception.
It really does. It paints such a clear picture of this evolutionary trickery. And the chapter provides some excellent examples of Batesian mimicry in action.
It does.
We have hoverflies that not only look remarkably like bees or wasps, but even mimic their buzzing sounds. That walks like a duck analogy really fits perfectly here.
It does. Predators often rely on making quick generalizations based on readily available sensory cues. If something looks and sounds dangerous, they're likely to avoid it. even if that danger is just an illusion.
Right.
False eye spots.
Yeah.
On the wings of many butterflies and moths are another fascinating example believed to startle or momentarily distract bird predators, giving the insect a chance to escape. And then there are a whole range of startle displays, subtle flashes of bright color or unexpected loud noises designed to briefly scare off a potential attacker.
Now, some forms of camouflage aren't about blending in at all. Take the striking black and white markings of a panda, for example.
Yeah.
That seems completely counterintuitive if you're trying to hide.
That's a perfect example of disruptive camouflage.
Okay.
The high contrast black and white patterns actually work to break up the panda's body outline against its natural background, especially in the dappled light of bamboo forests or even a snowy landscape. Instead of making the whole animal invisible, it makes it much harder for a predator to recognize its distinct shape. Think of it like trying to piece together a connect-the-dots puzzle where some of the dots are missing or misaligned.
That makes a strange kind of sense. And then there are zebras with their bold stripes. I've always heard the primary explanation for those was to create a motion dazzle effect, confusing lions during a high-speed chase.
That has long been the prevailing hypothesis, and it likely plays some role.
Okay.
However, more recent and compelling research suggests that the primary benefit of those zebra stripes might actually be something far less dramatic, repelling biting flies.
Really?
Particularly those pesky tsetse flies.
Flies don't like stripes.
Apparently not. Studies have shown that the striped patterns somehow disrupt their ability to land effectively. There was even a fascinating experiment where painting ordinary cows with black and white stripes led to a significant reduction in the number of fly bites they received.
Wow.
So those iconic zebra stripes might be more about avoiding irritation and disease than confusing lions.
That's a fascinating and unexpected twist.
It is.
To a classic natural history question. And the chapter mentions this as an example of convergent evolution, where unrelated species independently evolve similar solutions to the same evolutionary challenge.
Exactly.
The motion dazzle effect, for instance, seems to have popped up in various animals like snakes, fish, insects, and even squids.
Exactly. And that little personal anecdote you shared.
Oh, yeah.
About your wife's striped blouse making you feel slightly dizzy.
Yeah, it was quite disorienting.
Really illustrates the power of these high contrast moving patterns on visual systems, even our own.
It definitely makes you wonder how it affects animals with completely different visual systems. And it's so interesting how these camouflage principles we observe in nature have directly inspired human creations in areas like art, fashion, and perhaps most notably military applications.
Absolutely. The chapter specifically credits Polden and Thayer as early pioneers in the field of military camouflage, drawing heavily on their understanding of natural camouflage strategies. Thayer, in particular, was remarkably persistent in advocating for these ideas, even in the face of initial skepticism.
It's amazing to think that these principles we see playing out in the natural world have had such a profound and practical impact on human endeavors, especially in the context of warfare and survival. And the evolutionary arms race between camouflage and detection continues in the human realm, with increasingly sophisticated high-tech camouflage and equally advanced detection methods constantly being developed.
It's a continuous cycle of adaptation.
Yeah.
And counter-adaptation, mirroring the evolutionary battles we see across the natural world. Now, Batesian mimicry, while a remarkably effective strategy, does have its inherent limitations.
Right. The chapter mentioned a really key principle for Batesian mimicry to work effectively. The mimics the harmless pretenders need to be relatively rare.
Yes.
Compared to the models of the genuinely harmful species they are imitating.
Right.
It's like if everyone is pretending to have a security system, the signs eventually lose their deterrent effect.
Precisely. It's a concept known as frequency-dependent selection.
Okay.
The survival advantage of being a mimic actually decreases as the mimic becomes more common in the population. There's a brief mention in the chapter of the rare male effect as a related phenomenon in the context of sexual selection.
So what happens when a mimic does become too successful and starts to outnumber its toxic model? How does it maintain its protective advantage?
Nature, as always, often has clever solutions.
Okay.
The chapter provides a fascinating example of a West African butterfly that has evolved 5 distinct egg types.
Yeah.
Each mimicking the eggs of a different toxic butterfly species found in the same region. If one particular mimic type starts to become too prevalent, the ones mimicking the rarer toxic species suddenly gain a survival advantage because predators haven't learned to associate that particular egg appearance with a palatable meal.
It's like having multiple disguises in your repertoire ready to deploy depending on what's most effective at any given time. A truly ingenious evolutionary strategy.
And then you have the absolute masters of multifaceted deception, squids and cuttlefishes.
Yeah.
They can rapidly switch between an astonishing array of different color morphs and patterns.
Wow.
Not only for camouflage against various backgrounds, but also for communication.
Uh-huh.
And even to mimic the opposite sex.
Oh.
In some cases, to avoid aggression from other males.
They really take the second law of cheating to an art form.
They do.
It's incredible how quickly and effectively they can change their entire appearance to exploit different situations.
Now let's consider the flip side. What about prey species that are genuinely toxic or dangerous? Even if they possess potent defenses, a naive predator might still take a curious bite, albeit a potentially fatal one for both parties. How do these truly harmful creatures avoid that initial, potentially lethal encounter?
That's where those striking warning colors come in, right? The bright and conspicuous yellows, oranges, reds, and blues that seem to scream, "Stay away, I'm not worth the trouble."
Exactly. This is known as aposematic coloration.
Okay.
Many predators have an innate or learned aversion to these highly visible color patterns, associating them with unpleasant or even deadly consequences.
Wow.
It's the complete opposite strategy from camouflage.
Right.
Instead of trying to blend in,
Yeah.
you're being as conspicuous as possible.
Right.
Advertise your dangerous nature. This ties into the first law of cheating, honestly signaling your unprofitability.
So instead of hiding and exploiting a visual loophole, you're broadcasting a very clear and honest warning message.
That's right.
And when you see multiple toxic species in the same geographic area, all sporting similar warning colorations, that's likely an example of Müllerian mimicry.
Precisely. Named after the German naturalist Fritz Müller.
Okay.
This is a form of honest mimicry.
Okay.
Where multiple genuinely dangerous or distasteful species evolve to resemble one another by sharing a common warning signal.
Right.
They collectively reinforce the message to potential predators.
Yeah.
Meaning predators learn to avoid that particular color pattern more quickly.
Makes sense.
Classic examples include the viceroy and monarch butterflies.
Right.
And many species within the Heliconius butterfly genus.
So it's like a shared branding for danger where looking alike provides a mutual benefit to all the truly harmful species involved. Now, after exploring all these ways, the second law operates. The chapter then pivots back to the first law of cheating.
Right.
Actively falsifying messages.
Yes.
And introduces the fascinating world of eavesdropping.
Yes, because not all interspecies deception relies on exploiting cognitive loopholes.
Right.
Sometimes it's about cleverly tapping into and manipulating another species' existing communication system.
Oh, okay.
Fireflies are a prime and rather romantic example of this.
The flashing bioluminescence they use for courtship, it's like a tiny synchronized light show in the darkness.
Exactly. But then you have the devious voturous fireflies, the notorious femme fatales of the firefly world, who have evolved the ability to mimic the specific mating flash patterns of photinous fireflies.
Yeah.
They lure the unsuspecting photinous males in not for romance, but to devour them.
Talk about a truly deadly date. And the voturous fireflies even gain an additional benefit beyond just a meal from their unfortunate victims, right?
They do indeed.
Yeah.
They acquire defensive toxins.
Okay.
Called lucibufchins, from their photinous prey, which then help to protect the voturous themselves from their own predators.
Wow.
It's truly ingenious.
Yeah.
And rather ruthless.
Yeah.
Double win for the deceivers.
That's incredibly strategic. From the delicate light signals of fireflies, we then plunge into the deep sea and encounter the anglerfish with its